Hello, Facebook friends, citizens of America and the planet, revolutionaries and rebels. Welcome to tonight's Fireside chat. I hope you are hearing me okay, and it's good to be with you again. I'm taking a moment here while we gather up some folks, a little bit late in coming on tonight. Apologies for that. There is a lot going on. And I would love to hear your thoughts about where you would like to focus tonight's chat, because fireside chat means we're all kind of sitting here in the same room. So I'd love to start by just getting you to give me some guidance, some feedback, which way you'd like to take today's conversation. So there's a lot going on between Donald Trump's trip to the Middle East in particular, his meeting with the Pope. Pope didn't look too happy. I don't know if you saw the photos. The weapons sale to Saudi Arabia, his meeting with the Saudis, his talking about human rights violations in Iran while he's in the Mecca of human rights violations himself, the Mecca of undemocracy in Saudi Arabia. Iran did just have an election, it's true. Not the most, democratic place in the world. Definitely human rights violations in Iran, but Saudi Arabia kind of takes the cake, and they don't have any elections. It's just a monarchy. So we could talk a little bit about that tonight. We can talk about the budget, this extreme budget of greed and gratification for the 1%, this incredible budget. We can talk about the shift from social programs into the military, which is what this budget is all about. So give me your thoughts between the budget cuts, the military, the terror attacks in Manchester. I'd love to hear what's on your minds, and how are these budget cuts going to impact you? Some $800 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid, big cuts to Social Security, to disability, cuts to student loan programs for college loans, something like, a 13% cut to education, $9 billion worth of cuts. They're going to be giving students money to leave public schools. But what happens to these young people who leave their schools, who are sort of forced to go into other programs? They don't do so well. Turns out this school closure, forced people into charters, has a lousy track record. No surprise when you kind of break down one of the fundamental institutions of our communities, that is our public schools, and send kids off into far distant places where they have to commute and go through great difficulties just to get to school, new place, friends aren't there, they don't know the teachers. It's not great for kids and students. So as Willie comes to join us, let me turn to some of your questions here. British Columbia election results. Okay, yes, that's a very interesting development. In British Columbia, there were several Greens elected into their parliament, where Greens now hold the balance of power in the legislature. So it's part of a growing trend, because people world over are not happy at the way that everyday people, working people, are being thrown under the bus by the neoliberal agenda, which has taken hold certainly around Europe and North America and other countries as well. So, the usual political parties are not, shall we say, changing direction. So we see a big influx of support for the Green Party. We're seeing that here in the U.S., recently in California, just this past week. We saw once again the hopes of reform in the Democratic Party really thrown to the lions, where the DNC for California, the Democratic Party for California, I'm sorry, basically rejected their progressive candidate and elected a business as usual candidate. And, so much for the hopes of reform. People keep hanging on, thinking that one of these days we're going to change the Democratic Party. It's another case of fool me once, shame on you. Fool me hundreds of times. It starts to be shame on me for, hanging on to an abusive relationship, basically. A political abusive relationship, where people continue to try to make excuses for a party that keeps throwing us under the bus. So, time to move on. The DNC lawsuit, maybe we can talk more about that next week. I'll just say that there is a very exciting lawsuit now that is essentially suing the DNC for sabotaging Bernie Sanders' campaign. And I'll try to have some more details for you on that next week. Emily Cook asks, what's the status of the recount lawsuits? So the lawsuit is continuing in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, which relies almost entirely on paperless electronic voting machines, where you have no record to even show how you voted. So it's very hard to establish whether or not the vote was accurate. And where there is a right to a recount, but you can't exercise that right because of all of the bureaucracy and red tape. You're required, for example, to turn in petitions from thousands of districts, 3 people in each district. It's something like 27,000 people altogether that have to turn in their signatures requesting recounts in their districts. They won't let you do a statewide recount unless every single one of these 9,000 districts is represented by 3 people. And guess what? They won't tell you where it is. You are supposed to turn in your signatures. So it's all very mysterious, part of how we keep our democracy under lock and key. So we are awaiting anxiously the course of that case, now in state court, and if need be, it will go to federal court, and it will keep going because Pennsylvania has been really the poster child of a voting system which is truly a hot mess. There's also a lawsuit that may go forward in Wisconsin, which will enable us for the first time to actually examine the software behind these mysterious voting machines, which are owned and controlled by private corporations. And there are no standards for security or for accountability. So it's very important. Recounts are not for candidates. Recounts are for voters. And certainly that was the purpose of our recount campaign, because a lot of people are not, shall we say, confident in our election system. In fact, according to an Associated Press poll done about a year ago, it's 90% of Americans who have lost confidence in our political system. Jane Garrison says, we need to stop the arms sales to Saudi Arabia and defund the already bloated military budget. I couldn't agree with you more. The military budget is already, as you may know, Jane, it's already something like 54% of our discretionary budget, and it's almost half of your income tax dollars are going to this bloated military. Is it making us safer? I don't think so. Is it promoting the cause of democracy in the Middle East? Certainly not. Is it creating a more stable and secure Middle East? No. We have spent almost $6 trillion, if you include the forward-going costs of caring for our wounded veterans, and that care should be far better than what is provided now. But just looking at the dollars here, $6 trillion spent since 9/11, and what do we have to show for it? Failed states, mass refugee migrations, and worse terrorist threats. So this isn't exactly moving us in the direction we need to go. We need a peace offensive in the Middle East, exactly the opposite of what Donald Trump is doing. He's just completed a $110 billion arms deal to the Saudis, who are actively committing war crimes in Yemen and human rights abuses. Our own laws say that we cannot be selling weapons to countries that are violating international law and human rights. So this sale should not go forward. It's an absolute outrage. The total of arms sales to Saudi Arabia over the last 10 years is approximately equal to this first arms sale that Donald Trump has just undertaken. So this is, again, why we need to change the game going forward. And we'll come back to that. But Nancy says, we're creating terrorists. And absolutely, we've just had, as you know, another just horrific episode of vicious attacks on civilians. And this attack in Manchester was especially tragic and heartbreaking, and I just want to express our sincere condolences to the victims, their families, their communities, really to everyone. These horrible attacks resulted in the deaths of 22, mostly children and their parents, at a concert in Manchester, and an additional 50 or so people injured. Really horrible. But it's really important to remember that this is part of a very large crisis of acts of terror. I just heard on the news today that the number of civilians killed in Syria in the last month was 224, approximately, reported by a human rights group. And this is due to U.S.-led bombing in Syria. Some 224 people were killed this month. And it's every month, hundreds and hundreds of innocent civilians are being killed. It's that carnage that has been shown to actually inspire the terrorist acts taking place in Europe and in the United States. And the terrorist was identified recently as a young 22-year-old man, the son of immigrants from Libya, whose country was essentially destroyed by 6 months of bombing from NATO. So, in the words of Gandhi, it's become an eye for an eye until we're all blind. Bombing terrorism is not getting rid of terrorism. It's only creating more. That's where ISIS came from. We need a real solution, and the only one is to stop the madness. Let's stop throwing gasoline on this fire in the Middle East. We need a peace offensive in the Middle East, and that means a weapons embargo and a freeze on the funding of those countries that are continuing to sponsor terrorism, like through the madrasas that the Saudis sponsor all around the world. And who is it that we just sold over $100 billion worth of weapons to? The Saudis. Let's put an end to it. Jeremy asks, how do we address Islamic terrorism in a way that doesn't alienate all Muslims? Tolerance and thoughts and prayers are not enough. Exactly. And it's known that in addition to bombing the hell out of the Middle East, that is one factor promoting terrorism. But another is the it's the bias, it's the bigotry, it's the locking refugees out of integration into society, and that by integrating people into society, ensuring that they're in schools with good programs, social programs, after-school programs, anti-bullying programs, youth programs, ensuring that the refugees that we are driving here into this country and driving into Europe, those refugees need to be integrated. But more than being integrated, we have to stop creating the crisis of refugees in the first place. That's through war, it's through climate change, and it's through economic, racial, and gender oppression. This is a fixable crisis. James says, regarding the budget cuts, let's see if I can get the whole thing in here. regarding the budget cuts to SNAP and healthcare, just trying to get this in here, those responsible for this budget are murderers by proxy. You can see I have a very needy cat tonight. I'll tend to that after our fireside chat here. But yes, these kinds of budget cuts are absolutely shocking. You know, the odds that you will be killed by a terrorist, that is a terrorist abusing the notion of Islam and claiming to be an Islamic terrorist. The chances of being killed by such terrorism are essentially 5 times less than the odds of being killed by a lightning strike. So not very common at all. On the other hand, the odds of dying from poverty, lack of education, or the related problems, such as lack of health care, exposure to the stresses of poverty, to homelessness, to inadequate food, to the pollution that concentrates in areas of poverty and communities of color. There are approximately 500,000 deaths per year from those causes of mortality. And in fact, they're on the rise. We know that white people without a college degree have a skyrocketing mortality rate right now, even as their income is plummeting. So downward mobility hurts us, literally, figuratively, hurts our health. It actually is killing us. It's about 13% of the American population now that is in poverty, but it's almost half of the American population that is in or near poverty. So this needs to be fixed. The budget cuts that Donald Trump is imposing are horrific, and they are superimposed on decades of budget cuts to social services, to education, to health care, to homelessness, to social programs and youth programs. So this is cut upon cut. There is no fat to cut. This is cut on bone. This is cut right to the heart. And it's so disturbing that these cuts to social programs are the other side of the coin of boosting the budget for the military and granting enormous tax breaks to the very wealthy. I'm all for tax breaks for middle income, working people, and poor people who are really carrying the burden now after $6 trillion worth of tax cuts, largely for the wealthy, over the Bush and Obama administrations. Part of this was Obama. He extended a lot of Bush's tax cuts. But now, on top of that, we're having additional tax cuts, largely for the wealthy. If you are among the 400 wealthiest families in this country, you can expect a tax cut from Trump's proposal in the millions of dollars, not hundreds of thousands, but millions. Somewhere between $4 and $7 million is the tax cut you're going to receive if you are in the upper crust, which Donald Trump represents. So this is a big wake-up time right now. I'm going to take just a couple more questions here because we're getting close. And, you know, I just want to emphasize that this is sort of, you know, this is the dark cloud of oligarchy and of the two political parties that are bought and paid for by oligarchy, by Wall Street, by lobbyists, by corporations, by super PACs. That's the politics that we get. We got it under Democrats. We get it under Republicans. This is why we need an independent party. But what's kind of exciting right now, as horrible as these developments are under Donald Trump, the redeeming factors here are that people are standing up and we are resisting like we haven't in generations. And we're also winning the day on many of these critical battlefronts, including the fight to stop the Muslim travel ban, the fight to prevent the defunding of sanctuary cities, the fight against some of Trump's inner circle, including Steve Bannon, who's been sort of demoted almost to being invisible, the ousting of Michael Flynn. We've made progress. And now that Trump has basically been caught red-handed in obstructing justice in the firing of James Comey, which he admits himself was in order to stop the Russia investigation from going forward. He's basically been caught obstructing justice, which is grounds for impeachment. And I will just add, impeachment is necessary, but it's not sufficient because we have a deeper democracy problem here. That's why we need not only impeachment, we need a peaceful revolution at the ballot box. We need to keep the heat on in our communities and with political pressure, and we need to continue running candidates. We have some really exciting campaigns that are gearing up right now. I'll just give one quick shout out to Howie Hawkins in Albany, New York, where, in Syracuse. He's running for mayor of Syracuse, I believe, in a four-way race, which is very favorably, creates a very favorable landscape for Howie, who's been basically building the principled resistance in his community for really for decades. He's one of many. I'll mention in Massachusetts, where we have a very exciting candidate in Holyoke who is running for city council, Darlene Elias, who is one of the steering committee members in the Green Party and is also co-chair of the Green Party here in Massachusetts, running a very exciting principled campaign at a time when people are clamoring for it. You may have seen the smear campaigns are continuing big time. You can check out Mother Jones, which just joined the fray, really, what can I say, humiliating itself as not worthy of the word journalism. One simple fact is that none of the facts were checked out with me. They smeared me. Again, circulating this photo without facts. The couple of facts, so-called facts, alternative, incorrect, misleading facts that they mentioned were totally wrong, saying, for example, that it was after talking to Putin that we launched my presidential campaign, which interfered with the election, right? Like opposition parties interfere with the election. It's actually opposition parties that create real democracy. That's what's lacking in Russia. That's what's entirely lacking in Saudi Arabia. But Mother Jones, of all, all the so-called liberal media, is now joining the fray, basically circulating disinformation. And why did they not call me to check any of the facts? They're just being a megaphone here for the security state and for the warmongering and the military-industrial complex that's just looking to silence opposition parties and our policy, like creating a peace offensive to answer this problem of endless and ongoing terrorism, which is blowing back across, the Western world with a vengeance. So we need to stand up and fix it. We need to stand up and fight, not for the lesser evil, but for the greater good. The lesser evil just paves the way to the greater evil because people stop coming out to vote for it. So we can stand up, we can demand an America and a world that works for all of us, that puts people, planet, and peace over profit. The power to create that world is not just in our hopes and our dreams, it's in our hands. And just a couple last quick comments here, because we did start a little bit late. James says, let's see, Chelsea Manning freed. Yes, this is wonderful. And thanks to everybody who stood up for Chelsea Manning, who is, to whose credit we found out about the lies, the deception, and the war crimes that were being committed behind closed doors. And let's see. All right, so I guess that's all. Terrorism, the reason we're in the Middle East. All right, Jay Tank is asking, why are we in the Middle East to start with? And yes, absolutely, these are essentially wars for oil. To some extent, they're wars for markets. They may also be wars over who gets to put their pipeline through places like Syria, which is the conduit for all that natural gas, which we should really call unnatural gas, that come from the Gulf states, and whether it's going to go through Syria, through Turkey, who gets to put their pipeline where is what these wars have also become about. So absolutely, the real definitive solution here is a Green New Deal that transforms our economies on an emergency basis to 100% clean, renewable energy, so that we don't need to fight the friggin' wars for oil in the first place. Those wars for oil become obsolete the minute we convert to clean renewables. And in fact, when Pearl Harbor was bombed during the Second World War, you know how long it took for us to convert our economy to a wartime footing? It took 6 months. All right? Now, the bombing of Pearl Harbor was a drop in the bucket compared to the impact of allowing sea level to rise, as it is increasingly predicted to do so, according to Jim Hansen, potentially by 10 feet or more as soon as 2050. So, this isn't something we can sit around and wait for. We need to declare an emergency and convert our economy, because when we do that, we not only create jobs for everyone as a human right, we also turn the tide on climate change, we make the friggin' wars for oil obsolete, and we get so much healthier by ending fossil fuel pollution that the savings in sick care alone are enough to pay the cost of the clean energy transition. So I'm going to conclude tonight with just a thank you for tuning in, and a big thank you for standing up and resisting and pushing forward, as we need to do all together. I'd like to ask you to please like this conversation and share it so that we can build the resistance. Thank you for being a part of tonight's conversation, and let's keep fighting for the world that we deserve. More than ever, that world is in our hands. Thank you so much, and remember, green news is good news. I'll see you next week. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.